Good morning.
Good morning, Patrick.
My question, which I want to explore, is how can I make sense of the world in which I find myself confronted by the reality on Earth Day of the wounded Earth on which we live? Not only wounded in terms of nature, but also the impact of what we have done to the Earth on human health. And it's been my lifelong striving to work in the world of food and farming, and I want to talk about that. But it's also been a wish that I've had for the whole of my life to try to connect the inner and the outer worlds, because it seems to me that work in the world, unless it's connected up with some sort of inner or spiritual striving, can't deliver what is needed. So that's something I want to share as well. And during this work, and particularly recently and here, I've been helped by the work of others, and I want to share with you some of the help that I've had. And the first person I want to mention is the Prince of Wales, who wrote a book about 6 years ago, called Harmony, A New Way of Looking at Our World. And in this book, he explores the way in which everything is connected, that everything in the universe is governed and ruled by fundamental laws and principles which are inside us, outside us, in nature, inform the movement of the planets against the background of the zodiac. And everything is to be understood from that set of principles and laws. And yet we've forgotten that, and we've tended to separate our work in the world from this reality. And he is reminding us that we need to make that connection in our daily work. And so that has been one of my strivings. I also want to acknowledge the incredible work that the Festival of Faiths has done, because really the Festival of Faiths is the embodiment of bringing the spiritual strand and the work in the world together. And no initiative, it seems to me, better exemplifies this coming together of spiritual work and work in the world than the ideas that you have shared over many years, over more than 20 years at the Festival of Faiths. And particularly, I think the Compassionate Schools Initiative, the Louisville Compassionate Schools Initiative, is a groundbreaking initiative of world significance. And I have been personally inspired by that while I've been here. I think that what's really struck me is that mindfulness is a precondition to right action, and that's what's embedded in the Compassionate Schools Initiative. So I want to congratulate everyone involved with that program. And I was also very moved yesterday morning by the session in which we discussed compassion and feeling the emotion of being moved by suffering, and yet the need to find the balance between impartiality and being deeply hurt and upset by the realities of which we witness in the world. And I think that this discussion is really important between impartiality and mindfulness, and yet being deeply moved and upset by the reality of what we find ourselves. And in that connection, my teacher said, when asked what he taught, he said, "I teach that when it rains, the pavements are wet," very appropriate for our gathering. And it seems to me we need to witness what is, be struck deeply by the wounds that we are inflicting on the planet and society, but then act from a right place. And that's what I want to share with you now. So just to remind you how wounded the Earth has been, a man called Professor Johan Rockström, who's head of the Stockholm Resilience Institute and another initiative called EAT, initiated a discussion about planetary boundaries, the way in which our practices as humanity on planet Earth are exceeding the world's capacity, the planet's capacity to support us. And he's identified particular areas where human activity in the so-called Anthropocene is exceeding planetary boundaries. And they include soil, greenhouse gas emissions, air pollution, water, nitrogen fertilizer, and biodiversity. And he reminded us in a recent talk, Professor Johan Rockström, that he gave in Oxford with David Attenborough, that in each of those areas where our activity is exceeding the planetary boundaries, the main field of human activity responsible for this problem is food and agriculture. And he then went on to say that unless we change our food and agricultural systems, not just with a niche market, the kind of work that I've been doing in the field of organic agriculture, but comprehensively for the whole of our food systems, and we make those changes manifest, and in the world by 2050, we will face irreversible climate change and some sort of ecological breakdown. So that is the scale of the problem that we face. And so this gives rise to a question, what can we do? What can we do as individual citizens and collectively to take action now to avoid these realities which are coming at us so fast? And I want to share with you just a few actions that I suggest we can take. Firstly, we need to start with ourselves, because I believe profoundly that our individual action represents the cellular, the microcosm of the macrocosm. And if we can act from ourselves and take action in our own lives, we will be serving the larger whole, because everything is connected. And in taking action, we need to observe one of the principles of harmony, namely the principle of diversity. And we need in our future work in agriculture to remember that nature and diversity and agricultural practice and the health of soil, plants, animals, and human beings are one and indivisible. And so rather than separate conservation activities, which are going on throughout the planet, from food production, following the impulse and the vision of Rachel Carson back in 1962, we need to reintegrate food production with nature. We need to do that, we need to switch from chemistry to biology, and we need to take it further than that. So we have made the planet and the soil sick through using chemicals to artificially stimulate growth and then pesticides to suppress the inevitable disease problems. So we need to shift to a new approach where we promote the health of the soil by growing a diverse rotation of crops. And we can do that on a cellular basis. And I know this from 44 years' experience on my own farm in Wales, where I've been trying to put the principles of diversity and sustainability into practice with a herd of native breed cows making cheese, and I've also grown vegetables, and I know that the system can work. So if it can work on the farm, which is like the cell of the wider food system, then we can know that if we apply this approach at scale, then we can change things for the better. We also need to take a step up from the farm and think about the food system as a whole, and that's where we all come in our role as citizens and consumers. Because if we take action and change what we eat, and we align our future diets to the productive capacity of the sustainably managed farms in the rural hinterland of Louisville and Kentucky, then by extension, we will be co-designing the food systems that we need for the future. This is one of the most important actions we can take. We need to think about buying food which is in the proportions that the sustainably managed future farms of Kentucky can produce. So we need to become experts in the productive capacity of Kentuckian farms in terms of what livestock can be produced and what other staple foods that can be grown in the state can be grown in a sustainable way. And then we need to be loyal. We need to know our farmers and personally commit ourselves to buy their food. If we all do that, our food systems would be transformed. But, and it's no fault of the farmers that things are not changing faster, we need to remember that farmers are trapped by economic circumstances which force them to produce corn and soy, for instance, because the Farm Bill supports that. And in a way, they are commodity slaves. So there's a form of slavery going on in agriculture where the economic system forces farmers to do the wrong thing, which is against their own instincts. So we have to change the way in which the policy and economic framework operates on the farming community. And in that connection, one thing we can do is to pay farmers to be soil carbon stewards. And I shall be in Paris the week after next with a group of people who are inspired by an initiative which was launched at the COP21 talks by the French agriculture minister, Minister Le Foll, who said all the farmers of the world should set a target of increasing their soil organic matter by 0.4% per annum. He called the scheme the 4 per 1,000 initiative. And nations throughout the world and many organizations have signed up to this initiative, and we will be pursuing it in Paris. And I'm glad to say that the German Minister of Agriculture, who's very influential in the European Union, has making it his personal mission to do this. And I also heard last week, the week before last, when I was in Minneapolis, that there are moves afoot to link crop insurance incentives to farmers who can increase their soil organic matter. Now, to do that, you need to adopt crop rotations, which have a fertility building phase, which can take out the CO2 from the atmosphere and lock it into the soil. And it has been estimated that if all farmers throughout the world practicing tillage agriculture took those steps, we could take up to 100 parts of CO2 out of the atmosphere and get it back into the soil, because the soil is the world's largest carbon bank. So this is huge. And it would create an economic incentive to switch practice, because without that, it's going to be very difficult for farmers to take the right and necessary actions. I'll end not with a direct quote from Wendell Berry, but it starts with one, which is that it seems to me that whether we can take the necessary action in the time available all turns on our attitude towards suffering that we witness and compassion that it evokes from us. And it all turns on that because we need to witness what is, see that it's deeply troubling, let it affect our souls and affect our conscience, but we need to act from a calm place. And if we can find that place, and I believe a precondition for that is mindfulness and daily practice of preparing oneself for one's work in the world through inner reflection, then right action will follow. And although Wendell didn't exactly say that, I know that he would agree with it. Thank you very much.
So now we're going to take the next 15 minutes or so to have a conversation about what we just heard. And I want to, I have questions, and I want to invite everybody on our panel to ask questions, share thoughts, or participate as well. I think the planners here at the Festival of Faiths had something good in mind when they paired the two of you. I want to talk about something that you both touched on, which is the intersection of policymaking and imperative to act. And there seems to be an inverse relationship to the two of those things right now. You mentioned the Farm Bill. I want to start with Congressman Comer. You talked about being new to Congress and kind of learning the ropes. Congress moves awfully slowly in a world that moves quicker every day. How do you balance that, and how do you give the appropriate amount of weight to an issue with great imperative like what we're talking about this morning?
Well, you're exactly right, and the pace at which this Congress is moving looks like it's probably going to break records for slowness, but some people might like that. But with respect to the Farm Bill's passed every 5 years, so next year's when we're supposed to pass the Farm Bill. And in the Farm Bill is so many things for agriculture, but also your research for your land-grant universities through, in Kentucky, that's University of Kentucky and Kentucky State University are the two land-grant schools. There's also research opportunities for smaller schools like Murray State University, Morehead State, and Western Kentucky, where I graduated from, get a little bit of research dollars in the Farm Bill. Farm Bill also pays for and provides funding for the SNAP programs, which we're very dependent on that, especially in rural areas. You have to have more. We need more farmers markets in rural areas because some people think only food deserts only exist in urban areas. They are very prevalent, unfortunately, in rural areas as well. But we're already having discussions on the Farm Bill now, and that's obviously something that you have to have for agriculture as we transition and focus on the problems that we've had with respect to pollution, with respect to instances where the soil has been abused. I think we're working with the universities and research because farmers they need good soil or they're not going to be profitable. So you're seeing more practices, I believe, where you're seeing more instances of soil tests and more, especially the younger farmers have degrees and stuff, really understanding that it's important that we pay attention to soil health. And hopefully that'll be addressed in this Farm Bill.
I think you're absolutely right, and maybe I could encourage you, given that you're a unique freshman, with your championing of agriculture, to support changes in the Farm Bill which enable farmers to do what they probably like to do but can't do. And we just hosted Joel Salatin from Polyface Farm. I don't know if you've heard of him, but he's from Virginia, but he's an extraordinary livestock producer. And he reminded us in one of his talks that the fertility of the Corn Belt was built by the interaction of grazing ruminants over thousands, tens of thousands of years, and the soil and the grasslands. And if we want to restore the fertility which has been lost during the industrial agriculture period, we will have to change farming practices and introduce a rotation, and almost certainly that rotation will have to have a grassland element to it, grazed by beef cattle. You have beef cattle.
Yes.
And at the moment, we have a system which is segregated crop production from livestock production. Very few mixed farmers, truly mixed farming systems left in the US or the UK, but it would be possible if the Farm Bill created the necessary incentives for soil carbon stewardship, for a financial climate to be created where the dial shifted towards where the balance of advantage shifted for a reintegration of livestock production and soil fertility building and crop production. Now that would be a noble aim. And if I can do anything to help you bring that about, I gave you my card.
We'll be watching.
Because it can happen. I just want to say something about change, because I'm a bit of a hippie. I was around in the 60s. In fact, I was influenced by the San Francisco Bay Area because my dad was a visiting professor at Stanford. And I know that changes of consciousness can happen. And when you look back on times of changed consciousness, you can think, wow, where did that come from? And I think we're another of those times now, because the wounded earth is in such a precarious state that unless there is a big change of attitude amongst citizens, then we're not going to make the necessary changes. So we need to show you the heat, that there is enough interest out there that amongst voters who, if you took that action, it would be in your political interest, because that's what politicians have to do.
That's right.
Bless you.
Yes. And that's how you affect change, through political movement. And certainly, we live in a politically volatile time right now in America. And I am seeing more. I've been farming my entire life. You're seeing more crop rotation than you've ever seen. You're seeing more organic fertilizer than there was. I didn't even know what organic fertilizer was when I graduated from Western Kentucky University. But of course, it's a double-edged sword. You have a lot of poultry houses in the state. That has really helped with the soil health. The litter from those poultry houses, those are controversial. But
we have that too.
Right.
Yeah, we have industrial livestock systems, which paradoxically, the manure from which is needed by the soil.
Exactly.
In an ideal world, it wouldn't be toxic manure, which would then have to be transported way, way away from the big CAFOs. So we need to get the livestock back on the land so the manure is part of a cycle. And for that, we need policy
I agree with
incentives.
that. I agree 100% with that.
So, Congressman Comer is coming off of a series of town hall meetings, so I'm sure he feels right at home here.
I hope I didn't.
No, you're very polite, I believe me. Not everyone that goes to a town hall is a happy person. You're very happy, so I like that.
I want to home in a little bit on something you said and ask everybody on the panel to respond to this. And that is, you mentioned when you graduated from Western, you didn't know what organic soil was. Are we at the edge of a generational shift in understanding here? Do we have young farmers coming into the business who are seeing things differently and working in different ways?
I'll just briefly answer that. I think you're seeing a lot more emphasis by the next generation of farmers on being more sustainable, not on his level, but it's certainly much better than their fathers or mothers and their grandfathers or grandmothers in the past. And it's more economical to do what he wants to do. If you can use livestock and then crop and do the rotation, it's economically, it makes sense if you can do it. But where the Farm Bill could help is developing the infrastructure, the fencing and things like that. That would be through the EQIP programs and programs like that in the Farm Bill.
Further thoughts?
I mean, I think there is a shift going on. I think amongst so-called millennials, there is more interest in food in a different way than I've experienced during my whole time in farming. And I think that young people understand, probably, I was going to mention this in my talk, this genetic inheritance, or as now is being defined by science catching up with some of the ideas that are being discussed at these festivals, epigenetic inheritance of wisdom which comes down through gene expression and ways in which we hardly begin to understand, but which now science is validating. But in some way which is very exciting, the young people today they know things and they have an intuitive understanding of the need for change, which we are their fossilized parents who are stuck in an old way of thinking. Dylan songs come to mind, get out on the new road if you want to lend a hand. And I think that change is happening now, and I think it's manifest in a new food culture amongst young people in restaurants, in a lot of young people who, if they could find the way economically, would like to get back to the land in a 21st century context. And I think that the land-grant universities and the institutions can really help with that.
I have to say this, it's ironic that we're sitting here. The first person I ever remember talking about organic farming was Prince Charles. I don't know when that would have been, but that was the first experience I ever had, and first time that word ever made a wrinkle in my brain. So he's been a leader in that, obviously, ever since I can remember.
He has been a great visionary leader, and I think his influence on sustainable agriculture has been really important, and he's been proved to be right about all the things he's been saying for so many years. And I'd recommend reading his Harmony book, amongst other publications from him. Marc.
Well, I wanted to, you invited us to ask questions.
Please.
Yeah, so I'd love to ask the two of you, because you were carefully selected, and you've brought all this wisdom to us, and you both emphasize the fact, besides the fact it's in your bios, but it's important to both of you that you're farmers. And I wonder what is the most central piece of wisdom from your own practice of farming that's informing how you're moving into the policy area that you're in now?
I'll say this for both of us, because you'll know this, but maybe you couldn't say it.
Go ahead.
Most agricultural policy has been set over decades by people who had no practical engagement with agriculture whatsoever. And when you farm, you know what's possible, you know what could be possible. And I think that now we need much more practitioner influence on the policy setting process. And we need to acknowledge this, that it's crazy that if you're designing a future economic and policy framework which is going to affect public health and which is damaging the public health of America, that practitioners who know how the change could happen are not a voice which informs the Farm Bill reforms that are necessary. So let's make sure that you get in a position of key influence in making that happen, because you understand it. You know what I'm talking
No,
about.
I do know what you're talking about. You're exactly right. I agree with that. I'd agree completely.
And how about like eating habits also? Like our eating habits also influence,
Great.
right? How we grow our food. Like for example, like there's some movement of like eating local. So that's besides it's better and healthier, it's also like reducing our carbon footprints, because the transportation of food also contributes a lot to the damage of this.
It's so healthy because the idea of our biome, a microbiome, and the farm ecosystem, they're all actually related to place. So plants and animals, when they're bred on the same land, they become epigenetically adapted to the soil and climatic environment. So if we locally, we are more of the place. This reinforces our cultural, our sense of identity, and everything about us. So ecologically and spiritually, it's healthy to eat local and in-season food. We're only beginning to find out how important that is, but it's important for the health of the planet as well as our personal health.
I was really stunned reading the book 1491 about the Americas prior to Europe, coming here to learn about the milpas, which were the planting units in Mesoamerica that were sustainable for 1,000 years. And it was the three sisters of squash, corn, and beans. And they were good for the inside of the people, and they were good for the soil at the same time. When they got divorced from each other, and corn became a fad in southern France and northern Italy, people got very sick because they were eating an unbalanced diet that was also wrested out of its ecosystem.
There's been a disastrous narrowing of the gene pool, not just in nature, but in agricultural production systems, both of farm animals and of plants. And nothing could be more better illustrative of that than the genetically modified crops, where just a handful of varieties are dominating all the corn that is growing in America. And that never used to be the case. You used to have regional adapted varieties.